Thank you so much. Thank you, Marina, so much for the opportunity to come and join you guys. And thank you, everyone, for allowing me to speak. And I'm going to share some research. I'm going to do a little bit of two things today. I'm going to do a little bit of conceptual stuff as well as some data stuff. And I want to also thank the Kavli Foundation and the National Science Foundation. The data that we're going to talk about comes from some research we've done with the Kavli Foundation. So I just want to start with a little bit of a conceptual thing. So if you study health communication, we never say, my goal is to communicate health. It's just a thing we wouldn't say. You would say, I want to communicate to help people smoke less or something like that. Similarly, if you study environmental communication, which is another related field to the world of science communication, we would never say, I'm going to communicate the environment. There's a bit of a weird thing. We do this in science communication, and I'm going to argue, a lot of what I'm arguing is really that the goal of science communication is not to communicate science, not to communicate your science, not to communicate basic science. It's a bit semantic, it's a bit pedantic, but I think it really matters when we think about what we're trying to do when we communicate. So when I talk about science communication, when I think about science communication, it's communicating in the context of our science, right? So that, when I think about communication, it's not, our goal isn't to communicate science, it's in the context of our science. And I think this really matters when we think about goals. And I'm going to talk a little bit, we've used the word goals, I think we started talking about goals on Monday, and we've used this term, and I'm really going to push us to, I think sometimes we don't, what some people say are goals are not what I mean by goals, and certainly not how when I think about being a strategic science communicator. So generally speaking, my goals for today, for example, is I want scientists, communication scholars, communication practitioners to really, whenever they're communicating, whenever they're talking about their communication, to be really clear what their audience-specific behavioral goals are. And these audience-specific behavioral goals, I'm almost trying to never say goals anymore, but you just can't keep saying audience-specific behavioral goals. It's a lot. But that's what we mean. I also, the other thing I want, so another goal, I want science communication researchers to center audience-specific behavioral goals. And this last one's really important, and I'll talk about why, but generally speaking, whenever I'm giving a talk, whenever I'm sharing my research, I have a goal. So those first two goals, those are goals kind of for you. I'm not shy about saying, I want you to do something differently as a result of the communication that I'm doing today. But if we really take two-way dialogue seriously, and we don't just sort of talk about two-way dialogue as this thing, it means I also have goals every time I talk to learn things and change my own behavior in the future. So I'm designing my communication with the goal of changing myself all the time. And so that's when we think about goals. So I just want to model that. The reason I focus so much on behavioral goals is we have this discussion often about the importance of integrating social science into our communication activities. And one of the things, if you're communicating, if you want to use social science, the social science, I think a lot of the social science we have available to us is about they're built out around trying to get people to do things as a function of what people think and feel. And so when I think about audience-specific goals, there's this one version, so the number one goal we found in research, I'll show a little bit today, but also lots of other research. Scientists' number one goal when we ask them is for policymakers to consider their research in the context of decision making. Right? So consider your research, it's not a strong goal, but it's a sort of that's a behavioral goal. And I want them to turn to us for insight when they can. Now the flip side of that is maybe that we want the people that the scientists are talking with to share what they're thinking and so share their thoughts. And so this is when I think of goals, there's always this two side. Yes, there's things that I would love you to consider doing, but also I want communicators to think about what they would consider doing as a result of the communication. We can talk about that top part as a behavioral goal. The bottom part is a trust goal. It's actually, when we talk about trust as a behavior, we mean making ourselves vulnerable. And so this idea of asking someone to take our advice, take our insight, that's a trust behavior, and that's what we really mean by that. With apologies, Sabine, I cannot emphasize enough that strategic science communication and anything we've written about is not about promotion. It's about goal orientation. It's about making sure that you know the specific behaviors you're trying to encourage as a function of your science. When I talk about strategic science communication, when I write about strategic science communication, it has nothing to do with promotion. We never write about promotion, about promoting ourselves or reputation management. Reputation management in that regard isn't a goal. That's how do I want people to feel or believe about me. That would be what we'd call an objective. And so ultimately, the reason we focus so much on these behavioral goals, again, as I've already mentioned, is that once we know what we're trying to achieve, if we know that we want a kid to choose a STEM career, then we can start backwards thinking and like, what beliefs and feelings, what is it more, if they believed and felt a specific way, what would make it more likely that they might consider a science career? And so we need that behavior to be able to design out what we're trying to do. We don't want to, like, often I know when I ask scientists, what do you want to achieve from your communication? They might say, I want awe and wonder. And the obnoxious job that I have to do is, but why do you want awe and wonder? What do you think hope happens if you communicate it in the context of awe and wonder? And then we can say, well, is awe and wonder the only thing that makes it more likely a kid will choose a science career? There's lots of other factors that we might need to make sure we're communicating, and not just rely on that one note of awe and wonder, or that one note of curiosity. And so I'm not going to talk today about objectives and tactics very much, but this is when we think about what people think and feel. That when we say cognitive and affective communication objectives, again, a mouthful, but it is about differentiating this, what people do from what people think. And one of the really important things when we're thinking about strategy, again, people always sort of think of strategy as this really sort of mercenary kind of thing. And the idea of like affecting people's behaviors is, oh, it's a little uncomfortable with that. But the thing is, when you communicate, you're going to affect people's behavior. The question is just whether or not you're making really intentional choices about how you communicate, and so that when you affect them, you're doing it in an ethical and responsible way. All right, and so this is our broader model. So we have a book, of course, on strategic science communication where it focuses on, it's mostly focused on actually communication objectives. But often things that people talk about as goals for us are just not goals. Things like awareness, self-efficacy, risk and benefit beliefs, perceived shared identity, trustworthiness. Do you see scientists as honest and caring and competent? Those to us are communication affective objectives because they're things that occur in people's heads. They're not behaviors per se. And they're ultimately what a factor that influences behavior. And this is all on my strategic science communication website too, so don't worry too much about finding it. Everything here is pretty much publicly available somewhere. So now I'm going to get into a little bit of data. So we're going to have some surveys. So Kavli supported some survey data that we have. It's a survey data we collected from, we used journals. We went into essentially 6 fields that we know are sort of high amount of science where discovery researchers publish some specific fields: particle physics, astrophysics, neuroscience. There's a little bit of variation in there in that not everybody in those fields who are publishing those journals, and we extracted names, North American names from those journals, and we sent them a survey. There's about 2,000 people in the data set that we're doing here across 6 scientific areas. For today, I'm mostly going to clump them together, and it turns out there's not that many differences between the fields, and so it seems okay to clump them together. And this is the big one. I mean, there's 2 big ones. I'm not going to show you a ton of data. One big one is we asked about, to what degree, we gave them a bunch of audiences, and we asked them the degree to which those audiences were very important to them. And what we often find, interestingly, and I think Keegan at Kavli, we never actually, in previous studies, we never had internal leadership as a primary goal, but it turns out it's the most important primary goal for science communication, so who knew? But then we get some ones that make sense, especially, again, this is high basic science, youth. We know from our other research with sort of more applied scientists that youth actually aren't a really high priority, so it kind of makes sense in the context of basic science. We heard a lot about youth-oriented communication here today. And then policymakers, that's the one we usually see near the top when we do more applied groups or broader groups of scientists. And then there's the other ones. The one that really sort of bugs me is at the bottom, and this is like identity groups, so this would be environmentalists, conservatives, things like that. Weirdly to me, because there's so much need in those groups, that's the group that people prioritize the least, which is really interesting to me. So it's interesting, the private sector, it makes a little bit of sense in the basic science context, but that the idea that scientists aren't prioritizing specific groups that sort of have identities around ideology or activities like environmental things is really interesting to me. And this is the other big slide that I want to share. And this is tricky, right? So it's a 7-point scale, 0 not at all important, 7 very important. And what we find is that everything gets rated really highly, relatively highly. And so we could sort of think of but there is a pattern. And so I think what's important with anything like this is not to sort of focus right on the actual mean scores, but really to focus more on the pattern of results across things. And what we find there, and this is consistent with all the surveys we've done in other contexts, is scientists' #1 goal is they want people to use science when making decisions. And again, I word this very specifically, consider science in the context of making decisions. It doesn't say, I think there is one at the bottom. It's actually the one at the bottom that has advocate to increase the likelihood. That's actually almost the exact same question, but I just used the word advocate. It's a framing experiment. Just use the word advocate. As soon as you put the word advocate in, it goes right to the bottom. But it actually, conceptually, is almost the exact same thing as the one that's at the very top. Notice that trust is right at the beginning there, right at the top as well. Weirdly, the ensure scientific funding as a goal surprised me. That one's actually in our other sort of broader surveys of scientists has been really low. So maybe with basic science, it makes a little more sense that that's high, which is interesting. The last one, though, also is something that I really want to point out. Is this? So again, this way of having, when we talk about two-way, what do we really mean? We have goals. I want scientists going out there communicating. What are you trying to change in your own research as a result of communicating? Right at the bottom. It's always at the bottom for most of our research, which is a really interesting thing, which is a bit frustrating. I'm also doing some qualitative research, both with NSF funding and some work with some Kavli colleagues. So we're doing these, we do a lot of this work we're trying to help scientific organizations develop strategies for their communication efforts to be strategic, more strategic communicators and figuring out what they want to achieve. And so we start that process with a sort of an in-depth interview process asking all the scientists about, great, what do you want to achieve? Oh, I want to do awe and wonder. No, but so cool, awe and wonder is great. What do you hope happens if you do awe and wonder? Oh, there's too much misinformation in the world. And great, what do you hope would happen if if people had correct information? And what we ultimately get to with astrophysicists is they want to play a role in ensuring broad societal trust for science. And then they also have a sort of a more sort of grounded one, which is, we want often youth from particular groups to consider science careers. Nice, clear behavioral goals. We always push them as part of the strategic process to identify goals for, well, what do you want to change in yourself as a result of communication? It's a little trickier. A little bit of this idea around scientists, they want the scientists who work for these places to be more engaged in general. It's a bit tricky on how they identify goals for themselves. This other work we're doing with ecologists is a little more interesting because they're often basic scientists, but I think we heard before, even basic scientists, discovery scientists often have some applied work. And in there, what we often hear is the scientists' goals really are to get some group, whether it's landowners or decision policymakers or local residents, to consider science research when they make decisions about whatever it is they're making decisions about. They also are very eager. I mean, this is if you want someone else to share information with you, that's a behavior, right? So encouraging someone else to be willing to share with you is a behavior, and so they often have goals. This is great working with these ecologists. They rarely recognize that, yeah, we need to be making sure that the landowners, the resource managers who live near us are sharing stuff, and so it's awesome that those goals are coming up and being prioritized in our process. I'm not going to show, there's somewhere embedded in this thing is a whole bunch of statistical models of what makes it more likely that somebody chooses or prioritizes a goal. Generally speaking, what we find is people prioritize a goal as a function of the degree to which they perceive pursuing that goal would be beneficial. And particularly beneficial to society. Benefits actually has a bunch of different kind of ways of thinking about benefits. You could have benefits like useful, but it's more are useful or enjoyable or satisfying. Those are all different things. It's particularly that benefit of it's going to be useful to society. Therefore, I'm more likely to pursue those goals. On the contrast, other variables we typically use that sort of come from theory, your perception that other people prioritize the goal doesn't seem to be an important motivator or important driver of goal selection. Your sense of the degree to which you have the ability to achieve a goal doesn't seem to be that important a driver. In this specific case for importance. So we actually have a different set of models that focus around, this is overall importance. If you get into individual, how important is this for you specifically rather than for scientists like me, efficacy actually starts to matter a little bit more. The belief that you have the ability to pursue a goal makes it more likely somebody's willing to pursue a goal. Just a couple little other interesting data points. And I think on the SciPep website, there's a 60-something page report that has all the data you could ever want. One of the interesting things, again, I think this was Keegan, or Laura, was it Keegan, that really encouraged us to have the question about where goals come from, and they often come from individual scientists' priorities, which is interesting. One of the things we're trying to do is get people to think more about finding goals that come from their organization, that come from fellow scientists with whom they share goals. I think I mentioned yesterday, it's so important. It's great, all these wonderful things that individual scientists are doing, but if we want to have an impact, if we have an urgency to have impact with our science communication, we really need scientists who share goals to find each other and work with practitioners and sort of have more than the sum of individual parts. And I think this is my last data slide. One of the things, of course, where people were interested in, and so we have a bit of variation in the degree of basic science versus not basic science in the data set, so you can look at a correlation between the degree to which somebody sees a goal as important and the degree of focus on basic science, except that there's no correlation. There's very small correlations. There's another data set that a colleague collected with American universities. There's a little bit higher correlations in that data set, which says when they say AAU, that's Association of American Universities data that Todd Newman, and that's actually in the journal article that's in the packet, has a more detailed versions of these slides. But the key is, for the most part, your degree of focus on basic science actually didn't seem to matter that much in terms of goal importance, except for this one at the bottom, which is basic scientists seem to be a little bit less interested in goals associated with changing their own behavior as a function of their communication activities, which is frustrating, but also makes a little bit of sense in the sense of, if I'm an astronomer, and I go and say, hey, it's unlikely that you might change your research priorities because people you're interacting with say, well, yeah, I would rather not hear about black holes. What I really want to hear about is this other thing. So it makes sense in a sense that we see that, but it is still interesting to me. And I think oh, yeah. And so I'm just going to end there so we have time for discussions. It's okay. So there's another fun thing on our strategic science communication website is the set of comics, and I think actually this one's in the book too, is it? The set of comics that we had worked with Ray McTuffie to work on, who's a colleague in the U.S. Among other things, in addition to being a researcher, she likes making comics, and so we had her make. But this is the core conversation I ultimately want everyone to have when you're working with a scientist, when you're being reflexive with yourself, is to have this thing where you don't just take the first, if you ask somebody, why do you want to, why are we putting time and energy into communicating? What's our purpose? And if we stop at a think and feel, well, I want to increase awareness, I want to correct misinformation, I want to generate awe and wonder, that we need to push ourselves. But why do you want to do that? What do you hope happens from there? And get to that point where we have like, oh, I'd really love for this group of people to consider this activity, this behavior, that's really where we want to get to. At the end of the day, that's the thinking more deeply about, and this is also true when we give talks, right? So often when we give talks, I'm sitting and I'm like, well, okay, that sounds so cool. It's so neat that they're doing that. It's so creative. Wonder why they did it. What did they hope? What was their theory of change that made it more likely that they think is going to happen as a result of that? More than just, at the end of the day, it's great if you give somebody a positive experience with science, but I think we can do more than just giving people positive experiences with science. We can try to get people to use science a little more, if in context where that makes sense. And I will stop there, so we look forward to the discussion.